In this particular example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my gradebook based on the assumption that I'm going to be calculating student grades using weighted categories, and those weighted categories are going to be assignments worth 50%, projects worth 30%, and presentations worth the remaining 20%. This course also has a final exam that's going to be worth 30% of the overall final grade. So how do we set that up in our gradebook? Well, first of all, we're going to hop over to our gradebook. And I'm logged into a teacher right now, and we'll mess around with this gradebook since there's nothing in there just yet. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, select my course, English 32 IB. Now remember, we said that we were going to use assignments, projects, and presentations as our categories here. You'll notice that in the categories section, assignments, presentations, and project have already been created as categories that I'm going to use in this gradebook and perhaps other gradebooks. So let's start by, well, we've selected our course. Now let's hop over to grade setup. You'll notice that this is a first semester course. I only see term 1 and term 2. I also see an E1, which represents the exam in the course if there's an exam there. And I see Y1, which represents the entire mark, the final mark for this particular course. So let's start by selecting T1, and I'm going to double click T1, and you'll notice that the grade setup for T1 right now is calculating using total points. Now, of course, total points is I just take all of the assignments that are in my gradebook between September 5th and November 19th, which is the end of term 1, add them all up, and whatever the student earned over whatever the total points possible was, that's the mark. But that's not how I want to calculate their mark. Remember, I wanted to calculate the mark based on the different categories, assignments, projects, and presentations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select category weights. All right, with category weights selected, now I have to add my categories. So I'll click on the plus sign to add categories, and I'm going to add, we said we we're going to do assignments, presentations, and projects. So once I've selected my categories, I can add those to my gradebook. And now what I have to do is I have to assign the weights for those particular categories. Now, we want to make sure that the weights of all our categories add up to 100%. So I'm going to say assignments was worth 50%. We said that projects were going to be worth 30%. And the remaining 20% is going to be presentations. All right, so I've got my 100% in there. And I'm going to save that grade setup. Now that's the grade setup for term 1. If you take a look at term 2, I'm going to select it now. You'll notice that term 2 is still calculating based on total points. You want to make sure that whatever method you're using to calculate the final grade for your students in this particular class, that it's consistent from one term to the next. So what we can do is let's hop back over to term 1. I could go through that process again and add those assignments and presentations and projects and all that and put the weightings in, or I could just simply, after I have it set up for one term, I could say, all right, you know what, copy this setup, and I want to copy just the term 1 setup, and I want to apply that to term 2. And I can click next. And now if I click on term 2, you'll notice that term 2 is calculating exactly the same way that term 1 was calculating. So if I flip-flop between term 1 and term 2, you'll notice that there's no difference there whatsoever. It's calculating exactly the same way. Now, whether you do that copy and duplicate over from one term to the next, or whether you manually create those those categories and weight them from one term to the next term, it really doesn't make a difference how you do it. The important thing is that you're consistent between one term to the next. So we've got term 1 set up. We've got term 2 set up the way we want. Now, let's talk about Y1 for a second. Y1 is the final mark that the student is going to receive in the course. Now, we want to make sure that Y1 is calculating the mark correctly. And right now, Y1 is just looking at all of the marks in the gradebook, totaling them up, and giving the student a mark based on what they earned over the total points possible. Now, that's not how we wanted to do things. We wanted to take the student's mark that they earned throughout the course of the year based on those weighted categories, and then we want to factor in a final exam that's worth 30%. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to do term weighting to calculate the final grade for the course. So for Y1, I'm going to select term weights, and the only two terms that you see are are T2 and E1. Now, why don't you see T1? Well, T1 is actually nested inside T2 because, of course, we have a cumulative gradebook that runs the course of the entire semester, which is why you only see T2 and T1. So how are we going to set this up? Well, T2, which represents all of the work that the student has done since September 5th when your course began, we're going to say, well, that's worth 70%. The final exam that the student writes in this course is worth 30%. Hit save, and now your course is set up for proper grade calculation based on the assumptions that we talked about earlier, and those being assignments were worth 50%, projects are worth 30%, presentations are worth 20% throughout the length of that course, and then at the end of it all, there's a final exam that's worth 30% of the final grade.